Good afternoon, everyone. Oh, that's better. This is a communication school, after all. So we should be sure to communicate with one another. I really want to welcome all of you here today. I understand we have some special guests, some new admits to the Annenberg School for Communication and Journalism. Would you raise your hand? If you are a new admit, welcome. We look forward to seeing you in the fall. We also have guests from the Communication School at American University in Dubai, the Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid School. If I could ask our guests to raise their hand. They've just come in to spend a week with us from Dubai. Our students went over and visited with them a little while ago, so we're delighted to welcome them here as well. For about a year and a half, the school has been hosting a series of conversations on innovation, with the premise that in today's kind of environment for media and communication journalism, you either innovate or you die. Not to put too fine a point on it. You either innovate or you become irrelevant because things are changing so rapidly in the media environment. It's been a very exciting series. It's inspired, I think, the faculty, students, visitors, etc., to be more engaged with this. And one of the themes that we look at is that innovation takes place on at least 3 different levels. It has to occur at the individual level. Those are the people who innovate and inspire. At the organizational level, whether it's the Annenberg School for Communication or Disney or the Shanghai Media Group or what have you. And thirdly, it has to take place at the societal level as well. And so this year we have invited a number of our faculty to come in and talk about the innovative work that they are doing across these 3 levels. And also to pose the question, since you have been doing your innovation, what would you do differently at the start of your work that you have learned, that you didn't know at the beginning of doing this innovative work? If you had to begin again, what would you do differently? Or maybe nothing. But we do pose that question. The discussion that we're going to have today on BrandSpace fits perfectly within this initiative. Now, Henry, you're rattling a little bit. But that's okay. It's an innovative rattle. And I think it points to the wonderful work that we do here at the Annenberg School for Communication and Journalism by looking at the intersection of things. BrandSpace, branding could be looked at in a commercial sense, in a cultural sense, in an institutional sense. How do individuals brand themselves? How do institutions brand themselves? And no one could present this in a more effective and interesting way than one of our star scholars and star teachers, Professor Sarah Banet-Weiser, who has been doing very interesting work, not only in this area, but in a number of other areas as well. Her research and teaching interests include feminist theory, race in the media, children's media, popular culture, and national identity. And she teaches courses in the entertainment track here at the school, which is one of our most popular tracks. I think last year, I'll just mention this briefly, I think she mentioned, I think she published about 35 books last year.
Yeah, it's like 36.
30. But it was at least 2 or 3 well-received books that were published last year. In addition to her magazine and journal publishing, she's also just become editor of American Quarterly, which is probably the premier journal in the field of American studies. So it's a real delight and a real privilege for me to be able to introduce Professor Banet-Weiser, who's going to talk about a really, really interesting topic. And I do want to say, for those of you who are considering coming here, we do this every day. So yet another reason to come to the Annenberg School for Communication and Journalism. Professor.
Ernie, you've taken my talk.
Oh, well,
Let me have that.
let's not be that.
Yeah, I'm supposed to talk for 45 minutes. I can't. I gotta have my text in front of me. Thanks everyone for coming, and thanks for that introduction. And I really do hope that this isn't a reason for those of you who are considering Annenberg not to come. And I also hope that this work I'm going to present to you today, which is kind of an overview of this book I'm working on, that it actually qualifies as sustainable innovation. I think maybe I should have talked to Ernie about those three intersecting layers of innovation before I gave this talk, but you guys can tell me if it's innovation after you've heard me. I thought that before I go into brand culture and BrandSpace, which is my current work, I'd give you just a bit of an overview of my work in general to, for those of you who don't know me, to see as a way to see where I enter into the discipline of communication, and especially where I enter into the way in which we here at Annenberg imagine the discipline of communication to be. So I work in the area of critical and cultural media studies, and my work really focuses on how individuals create meaning about citizenship through their engagement with popular and consumer media and culture. So in that sense, I guess I would say that the main intention of my work is to kind of broaden and redefine the parameters of scholarship on the relationships between individual identity, citizenship, and media consumption. So for me, I see citizenship as a primary way in which we understand and identify ourselves and our sense of belonging. Even in a world that's characterized by global politics, transnational economies, and shifting national borders. So my focus on citizenship throughout all my work sees it as an identity that's formed within consumer and media culture, and what some of us call media citizenship or consumer citizenship. So through this focus on media citizenship, I try in my work to challenge some of the conventional ways of understanding citizenship as something that resides kind of wholly in a political or an officially political realm. So I try to challenge historical binaries that position politics as opposed to consumer behavior. And I see that forms of commercial and popular culture are not outside the realm of official politics, but on the contrary, it's precisely within consumer and media culture that our understanding of and resistance and acquiescence to official politics are really constituted. So I look at kind of odd places for these to examine citizenship. I've looked at beauty pageants, at kids' TV, at brand culture, places that really haven't typically been examined in terms of citizenship. And I do this as a way to kind of think through how such cultural products and practices can help us understand the concept of consumer citizenship more broadly. And in this sense, I pay particular attention to individual identities such as in terms of race, gender, sexuality, class, and difference. So that's kind of where I enter, which I thought might be helpful for you as a backdrop then to thinking about this new project. Well, it's not really new anymore. It's supposed to be finishing. So this finishing project on brand culture. This is, again, I'm going to give you just a kind of broad overview of this book that I'm completing. The book is called Authentic TM, Political Possibility in a Brand Culture. And I'm going to give you a broad overview rather than a specific look at individual chapters or the theoretical arguments that I'm making in chapters, though I'd be happy to go over any of that in Q&A. In terms of how I've gone about doing research for this book, I want to say a couple of things. First of all, the book focuses on youth culture and brand space and brand culture. And I focus on youth culture for two primary reasons. One is just completely practical and logistic. You can't write about everyone. And you need to kind of make a decision about who you're going to write about. And we all live our lives within brand culture, I would argue. So I had to kind of make a decision about what group I was going to focus on. I chose youth culture because while, again, certainly every other demographic group participates and are constituted by brand culture, Branding, I argue, is one of the central narratives of contemporary youth organizing, political formations, and identity construction. The contemporary youth demographic is a particularly vexing one for traditional marketers, as many of us know. The group represents billions of dollars in buying power. Yet this group is notoriously difficult to reach through conventional advertising because of a kind of general cynicism toward marketing messages, a shifting political economy, and a kind of fragmented and complex media landscape. So capitalist practices have had to be retooled in efforts to reach the youth audience, involving key branding strategies of engagement, authenticity, and creativity, and which I'll talk about in a little bit. So that's kind of why I chose youth culture to focus on. In terms of how I go about doing research, I typically have a multi-methodological approach, and this project is no different. I've interviewed brand managers and marketers about how they approach the practice of branding. I conducted a kind of mini ethnography at an advertising firm where I was a visiting professor and given an office and sat in on tons of branding campaign meetings and interviewed everybody in the firm from leadership on down to entry-level positions. I've done critical and cultural analysis, which is what you're going to hear primarily today, of contemporary branding campaigns and cultural formations. And I've worked in collaboration with my faculty working group. I love the clicker. BrandSpace, which is sponsored by the Norman Lear Center, and which is an interdisciplinary group of faculty, some of whom are here, where we meet and talk about the various ways in which we're thinking about branding, what it means for us as scholars to be thinking about branding, how could we imagine a different sort of branding paradigm, what are the possibilities within branding, and so on and so forth, how it forms communities, and just a kind of a variety of different topics. We also have kind of expanded activities of the BrandSpace group. Last semester, we had a couple who owns a branding company come in to talk about their recent campaign on branding the city. They were branding the city of Phoenix. Who knew? Upscale desert garden. That's what it is. Anyway, place for divorcees. So we have people come in. I also, with the Visions and Voices grant from USC here, I had a conversation with the cultural entrepreneur and street artist Shepard Fairey, where I talked to him about the intersections between art and commerce and politics, which are kind of the questions that I'm interested in. So that's how I go about conducting research for the book. As a way to begin giving you an overview of what I'm thinking about, I want to share with you a brief story. A couple of years ago, the Wall Street Journal published an article titled, "In West LA, a Homeless Man Inspires New Brand." And the article detailed the emergence of a new clothing line featuring $100 t-shirts, a MySpace page, and a nightclub promotion venture, all inspired by a local LA homeless man. The brand was called the Crazy Robertson, which referred not to the man's name, but to Robertson Boulevard, the kind of trendy LA shopping area where he lives. And it's clear that the branding strategies of what the Wall Street Journal called the young entrepreneurs who signed a contract with this homeless man can be positioned alongside other recent branding strategies that capitalize on the homeless, such as the DVD franchise Bum Fights, where fights between homeless people are staged, filmed, and then sold as DVDs online, and reality TV programs such as Homeless Youth TV, which is a social awareness online campaign that asks viewers to sponsor homeless youth who star in videos that are ironically titled after contemporary reality shows. Meal or No Meal, American Idol with an I, it's very clever, and Project Runaway. So this recent media focus on the homeless is largely marketed to youth, and in some ways, these kinds of topical brand ventures can be understood as just the kind of latest business maneuvers in an increasingly competitive urban youth market. However, for me, they also prompt questions about how and why and in what ways branding strategies have expanded beyond conventional marketing and into lifestyles, identities, and culture itself. So my current project is preoccupied by these kinds of questions. And I argue in this work that beyond just merely encroaching into new domains, branding strategies suggest a reshaping and a reimagining of these domains so that it's more accurate to think of not branding expanding into culture, but branding as culture itself. So for me, the appending of brand to culture means that I'm tracing what I'm thinking about as the revaluing of culture in the contemporary moment, a mapping out of the aesthetic, technological, and affective moment when brand culture becomes culture. So to that end, this book and my work in general is really about changing definitions of value in culture. Value is about monetary and material worth. It is about collective decisions on what is desirable and good. It is about principles and standards. It is about a rating system that tells us what matters and why. And it's about how all of these definitions inform and constitute each other. How do we value persons, things, identities? How is value accrued in culture? How do we produce cultural categories of value that we use to recognize ourselves in society? What are the connections between the political economy and the various ways in which we organize our lives, our communities, our relationships, our politics? What are some of the technological and political and cultural transformations that shift historical definitions of value and make room for new ones and new definitions and new transitions? So really, what does cultural value mean? And I try to answer this question by looking at brand culture, because I think these are the questions that we need to be asking if we want to have a way to get at the cultural and critical significance that the brand has in contemporary capitalism. This is especially true for me in an era when the Obama brand is part of everyday parlance, when Sarah Palin is very, very hard at work in reimagining and performing the new Republican brand, and Christian clothing stores brand religion through T-shirts that are emblazoned with things like "Jesus is my homeboy." And as lots of you have heard me say probably too many times, you're going to have to hear it again, even academics and those of us who work in areas that are conventionally seen as outside the world of advertising and marketing are increasingly asked to cultivate our own individual brand as a way to strategically market our professional and personal identities. The interesting thing to me about this is that this use of the language of the brand is almost completely unremarked upon. The language of the market has so permeated our cultural, personal, and political lives that it is now essentially normative. And it's true, any glance at 21st century cultural, social, or political life in the US offers lots and lots of evidence that regardless of things like race or class or gender or age, we live our lives in brand culture. Certainly, advertising continues to have a kind of, dominant presence in both public and private spaces. But what distinguishes contemporary culture for me is not the ubiquitous ad, but the normalization, the unremarked upon presence of brand culture. So in this book, I take this normalization of brand logic really seriously. And I theorize brand cultures for their contradictions, their complexities, their contingencies. And importantly, while I'm critical of many brand cultures, I also see that brand culture can be something potentially mobilized toward progressive political ends, precisely because it is culture, precisely because we do have a part in making it. So this is especially true, I think, in terms of youth culture, where the political economy of neoliberalism has expanded to privilege a brand strategy in producing goods and services and resources that work to manage and contain and actually design identity, such as diversity and difference. So in this book, I pay particular attention to the ways in which brand cultures form boundaries of race, gender, and class so that some identities emerge as important and more worthy of the brand and are therefore more culturally valued. So, given that I'm interested from a critical and cultural theory approach in how it is that particular cultural formations are increasingly made legible and understandable, not within not only just the language or the vocabulary of the brand, but also the practice of branding and brand management, it seems to make sense to have a discussion of what I mean by the brand in the first place, and how I see this concept in broader cultural terms. So first I should say that I'm interested in the concept of the brand, not simply or most importantly its material markers. These are the material markers of the brand, right? Trademark logos, design, unique packaging, names, right? These are material markers of the brand. But without a story behind these markers, they don't have meaning, right? They're empty. Without an effective and emotional connection, these kinds of material markers of the brand don't have meaning. So I turned to the people that I've interviewed. I've turned to lots and lots of marketing books and brand management campaigns to get a sense of how marketers understand the story behind these material markers. So here's one definition. This is from a marketing professor, Douglas Holt, who wrote a book called How Brands Become Icons. And he says, a brand emerges as various authors tell stories that involve the brand. As these stories collide in everyday social life, conventions eventually form. A brand emerges when these collective understandings become firmly established. This story that Holt is talking about is what I'm interested in, and how this story becomes a dominant narrative of culture in the contemporary context, and how we, as authors in this story, or as actors within culture, become particular kinds of characters in the story of the brand. And it's clear from the research that I've been doing over the past several years that branding strategies and logics have gone through significant transitions, especially in the past few decades. Branding has had to become something that is understandable not as a simple economic transaction. It's not about whether or not you buy Coke or you buy a Mac, right? It's rather about establishing and creating a kind of relationship, one that makes sense in an effective, emotional, or what some people call an attention economy. And marketers have been really quick to pick up on how to capitalize on and create this relationship within this effective economy. To give just a few examples among many, some of you may have heard of Kevin Roberts, the CEO of Saatchi & Saatchi, who has famously renamed the branding practices of that firm as love marks, saying that for great brands to survive, they must create loyalty beyond reason in consumers. This is the only way they can differentiate themselves from the millions of going nowhere blands. The secret is the use of mystery, sensuality, and intimacy. It's very hard for me as someone who reads semiotically to not see how loyalty beyond reason, mystery, sensuality, and intimacy are all caps and therefore are kind of transformed from concepts into products or brands themselves. Another marketer, Alina Wheeler, who wrote a book called Designing Brand Identity, echoes Robert's sentiments. And she says, brand is the promise, the big idea, the reputation and expectations that reside in each customer's mind about the product and or the company. It is a powerful yet intangible asset. Brand is about making an emotional connection. People fall in love with brands. They trust them, develop strong loyalties, buy them, and believe in their superiority. But while marketers such as these folks are interested in crafting this relationship, and they're interested in harnessing brands to emotional culture, they're interested in making brands an inseparable element of culture, I'm actually interested in approaching contemporary culture from the opposite direction. That is, my question is not about how to harness brands to culture, but rather what sorts of transformations and practices exist already within contemporary culture that allow us and authorize us to understand things like emotion, affect, and culture itself in the vocabulary and the logics of the brand. What is it, in other words, about culture that seems to increasingly make sense only in the language of the brand? Right? So I come at it from the opposite direction of the marketers. And these are the kinds of questions that I'm asking. So it's clear to me that from reading all these marketing books, talking to marketers, working at this ad firm, that there are at least 5 elements of a successful contemporary brand that work to establish this emotional and effective relationship. Right? Every brand has to have a history. There has to be a story to a brand. There has to be something behind the material marker. Every brand has to involve creativity. It has to be something that is creatively understood, that is about authenticity, so that you feel, that the brand is speaking to you as a unique individual. It has to have spirituality, loyalty beyond reason. Right? Something that is like religion, has that kind of emotional connection. It has to have politics. Increasingly now in the contemporary era, brands have some kind of unambiguous political platform, right? Free trade coffee, green branding, the red campaign. It has to have some kind of ideological component. It's not just a product. It means something more. And finally, it's about self-identity, right? It's about how it is that we understand ourselves. We understand it in the language of the brand. So marketers have built these components into the story of particular brands so that, for example, I'm loyal to and have a kind of spiritual connection to the Volkswagen Beetle, right? I identify with Harley Davidson because that brand is authentic in a world of cheap knockoffs, right? I buy a Toyota Prius, or Larry buys a Toyota Prius because he cares about the environment, right? That because he's politically motivated. I drink Coke instead of Pepsi because Coke has a history told to me through advertisements over the years, right, that I can relate to. I am a Mac user because my self-identity is of someone who thinks different, is cooler than those PC people, and is not old-fashioned or stuffy. Right? That's how marketers approach it. What I'm interested, again, comes from the opposite direction. Not about how individual brands harness culture to the brand, but rather about how cultural formations are increasingly recognizable in the language of brands. So these elements, history, creativity, spirituality, politics, self-identity, these are also cultural formations for me. So in the time that I have left, I want to just kind of briefly go over these 5 elements of culture, of brand culture, which form the 5 chapters of this book. So I take these 5 components of what defines a brand and a brand relationship, and I extend them to cultural formations. So the history of branding, the branding of creativity and authenticity, the branding of religion and spirituality, the branding of the environment, and the branding of the self. So first, history. The brand has to have a story. It has to have a history. And for me, I situate this history within a kind of consumer capitalism history of the United States. So I situate brand culture historically as a way to tell its story, and I trace the historical connections between understandings of individual and collective identities, the contours of citizenship, and consumer society. And I think that this kind of historicizing is necessary for a couple of reasons. One, you need to construct a narrative about the logic of brand culture and citizenship in the contemporary era. It's also necessary for me to use history as a way to make an argument about the complex intersections between things and social relations, which is really what this book is about. I will say that while telling the story of brand culture, I don't attempt to offer a kind of linear, progressive history that somehow leads logically to brand culture, but rather I'm suggesting a heuristic, a kind of overlapping set of logics and practices that provide the context for the recent acceleration of brand culture. And in order to address these logics and practice, in this history part of the book, I offer an examination of consumer brand culture from 3 transition moments in U.S. culture: mid-20th century mass consumption, late 20th century niche marketing and post-Fordist capitalism, and late 20th century, early 21st century individuated marketing and neoliberalism. And in fact, neoliberalism does become the big story for me here in thinking about brand culture, because neoliberalism's characteristic cultural economy, the technological apparatuses that support it, and the emergence of brand culture provide, I think, a context for a different shaping of brands than in previous eras. I won't go too much into it now, but the period of neoliberalism has been kind of mapped onto different moments depending on where you see or what you see as an impetus for shifting political economies in Western culture. Arguably, we're going through another transition since 2008, and kind of remains to be seen what's going to happen here. I put the NAFTA flag here because some say NAFTA is the kind of hallmark of neoliberalism. Other people say Margaret Thatcher. Some people say Reagan. Regardless of the precise timing, it's clear that by the end of the 1990s, neoliberalism was the dominant political economy in the West. And among other things, neoliberalism is a theory and a practice that proposes that individual identities can best be formed by liberating individual entrepreneurial freedoms and skills within a framework that is characterized by strong private property rights, free markets, and free trade. In other words, the individual and the individual entrepreneurial skills and freedoms are understood within this institutional framework. Okay, so what that means for me is that within neoliberal capitalism, those realms of culture and society that were once considered outside the official economy, things like emotion, individual relations, social relations, culture itself, are harnessed, reshaped, and made legible in economic terms. Another crucial part of this historical story of brand culture that I'm telling here involves technology. So mapped onto each of these historic transitions are the technological structures that created and supported and enabled by different understandings of consumer capital. So, in the mid-20th century US, that would be things like broadcast TV. In the late 20th century, that could be something like cable. In the early 21st century, that could be digital media. So I look at the technology and how it kind of connects up to these economic transitions, and tell the story of brand culture by focusing on these overlapping logics. Then I moved to creativity. This is Shepard Fairey in New York, wheat pasting his Obey campaign on a public space. Here I look at the new creative economy as a crucial tenet of contemporary brand culture, and I focus specifically on the relationship between art and brands. This chapter looks at the emergence of both the contemporary cultural entrepreneur and the creative economy as important factors that sustain youth brand culture. Cultural entrepreneurship has taken on new dimensions in the past two decades, with an increasing number of artists and musicians moving seamlessly between making art, creating brands, marketing their names, starting clothing lines and small businesses, selling their cultural capital, all without losing their status as radical artists or authentic artists. So within contemporary youth culture, alternative bands liberally sell their music to advertising agencies. Artists design brand campaigns or ad campaigns for mainstream brands, and they market their own apparel brands. Rather than dwell here on a debate about whether or not these kinds of practices are authentic or selling out, I'm interested in the way in which the contours of the neoliberal cultural economy allow for particular kinds of creative expression to be branded as authentic. In other words, I'm interested in how authenticity itself has become a brand, while other things are dismissed as corporate strategy. So in this sense, neoliberal brand culture is not simply a new business model for corporations. It's not simply a way that corporations can appropriate artists or art, right, or music. Rather, it's a new way of imagining culture as inextricable from a business model, and subsequently a kind of a new way for imagining new routines of everyday life as crucial elements of this model. So as such, brand culture provides this milieu for particular convergences to take place and circulate, such as the convergence between the authentic and the commercial. Certain street artists maintain an authentic aura in their creative productions precisely because, again, authenticity is part of the brand. So here I look I look at artists such as Shepard Fairey and Banksy and other street artists. I also examine other commerce art intersections, such as the work of contemporary artist Murakami, Kehinde Wiley, the annual Burning Man Festival in Black Rock, Nevada. And I'm looking at these folks to talk about these intersecting networks of things like cool websites, blogs, street graffiti, guerrilla marketing, and more official forms of art making that enable artists such as these to be outspoken about their politics and to connect politics to certain products, often without any kind of problematic discussion or cultural conversation, and often exploiting a politically invested youth population as a lucrative marketing niche. So that's the work on creativity. I then look at spirituality, the aforementioned Jesus is my homeboy t-shirt. In case you want to buy it, you can go online. Here, I look at the branding of religion as a particular political and cultural expression within neoliberalism, and I examine the rise of branding strategies that are connected to retail chain stores and popular media that market religious identity products, to talk about how these products comprise and construct culture. I have a specific focus here on the branding of Christianity, and I situate these practices within a larger historical frame of particular forms of religion and white youth. So, for example, I examined the emergence of a religious company called Revolve, who produces these things called Bible zines, which are a kind of book magazine series for young girls that are visually crafted to look like gossip or fashion magazines. So they look like Cosmo or Vogue, but they're actually the New Testament. I actually didn't think that they really were the New Testament. I thought it was maybe a comment, but no, it's really the New Testament. I also look at popular films and popular media such as Saved, Jesus Camp, Holy Hip Hop, and Twilight, which of course I've had to watch many, many, many times in order to kind of do this kind of research. I look at religious TV that's targeted to youth, such as JCTV, which is a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week youth ministry channel with the tagline, Genuine, Real for You. I look at clothing stores such as C28, which this is from, where souls are saved while you shop, and where you can buy not only What Would Jesus Do bracelets, but also more ironic and edgier T-shirts like Jesus is my homeboy. There's also a Jesus Tour shirt with the first venue as Galilee. And finally, I look at the increasing presence of the megachurch and new evangelicals targeting a religious and racially specific youth population, looking at people such as Rick Warren and his Saddleback Church. So I specifically look here at Christian forms of marketing as another cultural site in which identities are constructed within the confines of brand culture, because these strategies have particularly targeted a youth population in the past decade. Advertising faith, the lifestyle branding of Christianity, has become a clever business strategy, especially in the contemporary political context of the U.S., where what used to be called the radical religious right is now mainstream business and politics. So for youth culture, especially white and middle-class youth culture, branding the Christian lifestyle represents a new marketing and business opportunity, where there's not one specific product, but rather a politically diffused notion of identity that is crafted and then attached to a variety of different consumption acts. In an era of new technologies and neoliberal capitalism, religious branding has capitalized on these market strategies and these logics as a way to kind of capture a youth audience. And I will say, of course, this is, marketing religion or commercializing religion is nothing new. It's historically been commercialized in different ways, rise of Christian rock, TV, and everything else. But I argue in this chapter that the political economy of neoliberalism encourages a shift from the commercialization of religion to the branding of religion, where brand strategies intersect with consumer activity and content to create a brand culture around religion, and where capitalist practices merge with religious practices in kind of an unproblematic normative relationship. Next, I turn to politics, represented here by Whole Foods Market. I take a broader look here of political identity and branding, and I focus really on two different kinds of political brand cultures, consumer philanthropy and green branding, with paying particular attention to how these practices are inclusive of particular socioeconomic classes, which is referenced here by the Whole Foods Market. It's common in the contemporary economy for branding companies to take, like I said earlier, an unambiguous political stance as their major selling point. Anti-sweatshop labor, anti-factory, anti-waste, anti-brand. Look at American Apparel, right? All the while relying upon mainstream channels and practices to sell their products, and all the while charging high prices for these products so that only particular socioeconomic classes can afford to care in this particular way about, say, the environment. Consumer philanthropy, including campaigns of corporate social responsibility, involves contemporary consumer practices that function to support the cause and claim to have important social impact. So consumer philanthropy is increasingly manifest in a mediascape that's created and sustained by Hollywood celebrities, popular media personalities, and participatory consumers. In this case, humanitarianism, social advocacy, and political practice take on new meaning as lifestyle politics, often connecting directly to consumption practices. And importantly, the kind of new spin on this consumer philanthropy in recent eras is that it is not talked about so much as philanthropy, but talked about as the kind of pleasure and desire that you can get out of consumption while doing good. So in an article I wrote with Charlotte Lipsansky here at Annenberg, one of the, which was about the RED campaign, Bono's RED campaign, which is you buy products to give money to women and children with AIDS in Africa. And one reporter who was raving about the RED products said, quote, "When you have to decide if you're going to wear skinny jeans or if you're going to support the fight against AIDS in Africa, why not do both?" So why not, indeed? That's what I'm looking at here in terms of consumer philanthropy. Aside from consumer philanthropy, I look more specifically at green branding and the consumption practices that support it, such as ethical consumption, and how these things are celebrated as responses to environmentally problematic consumption patterns that have characterized at least the last 50 years of Western culture. So I situate contemporary green branding as an outgrowth of neoliberal capitalism and explore some of the, kind of contradictions and contingencies and practice such as greening one's house, buying hybrid cars, organic farming, university policy, and so on. And I also discuss how this kind of consumer product growth industry of green branding may in fact make available spaces for something like green consumption to be lived as an everyday practice rather than as a peripheral activity. I'm going to rush through because I'm running out of time. My last chapter is about self-identity, and here I examine the practice of self-branding. And I do it specifically from a gendered standpoint. So I look at the way in which neoliberal brand cultures, new technologies such as social network sites, and the discourse of post-feminism coalesce and then rationalize what I'm calling a new social arrangement for the gendered body. This social arrangement is also one that creates new kinds of citizen consumers, new brands for identities, and techniques for managing and governing these brands. So I look at the branding of the post-feminist self on social network sites like YouTube or personal profiles on MySpace or on Facebook, and talk about these as a kind of nexus of these different discourses. And to take YouTube as just a quick example, you know, the transition of YouTube historically from a kind of personal digital video repository into a place where one can broadcast yourself is clearly, to me, not just an effect of the expansion of Web 2.0 technologies, but is about self-branding, a practice that's deployed by individuals to communicate personal values, ideas, and beliefs using the strategies and logic from commercial brand culture. So, and one that is increasingly normative, like I said before. So I look at girls who post videos on YouTube as expressions of themselves, personal profiles on Facebook and MySpace as a way to talk about how the ideals and the accomplishments of the post-feminist subject, independence, empowerment through consumption, capability, are also those ideals that define the neoliberal subject. And these, in turn, are created and are supported and enabled by similar assumptions about the contemporary interactive subject, who realizes her individual empowerment through and within the open, flexible, and branded architecture of online spaces. So to kind of wrap up, I define brand culture broadly as the deliberate association of products and trademark names with things like ideas, concepts, feelings, and relationships. And I think that this culture creates a context within which consumer participation is not simply, or even most importantly, indicated by purchases, by what we buy, but rather by brand loyalty and affiliation. So linking brands to lifestyles, to politics, to social activism, to culture itself. Buying pink athletic wear to support breast cancer, supporting free trade through a cup of coffee, the development of university logos, identifying with cellular ringtones, becoming part of a family of automobiles, trying to figure out how to self-brand as a scholar of branding. All are examples of the myriad ways brand cultures provide context for everyday living and the construction of our identities. Thanks.
We'll open up the floor to questions, comments that you'd like to share. If you could also just briefly state your name when you ask the question so that we know who's who in the room, that would be great. Thank you. Yes, Tom.
I'm curious, I'm fascinated by the connection between the brand and national identity, which played out so interestingly recently in the whole Google conversation, where denial of doing business in Google was a symbolic fissure between U.S.-Chinese governmental relationships, as well as a strong statement, particularly the younger Chinese, about, look, there's a world out there that we may or may not be able to access. So I'm wondering if you could sort of talk about other similar controversies that you may envision, or how these things actually get negotiated.
And particularly about national identity. Yeah, I mean, I think that another kind of the recent FCC agreement about net neutrality is another way, the way in which there's now a policy decision and governmental decision that states that corporations are citizens and have then the rights of citizens, and things like political campaigns contributing to these things. These are all examples, I think, of how this normative quality of brand logic and brand language is something that's kind of unremarked upon. I mean, we've been kind of afraid of the corporation as citizen, as scholars for a long time. But once it actually happens, it doesn't seem to have the outcry that you would think it would have, that these kinds of rights of citizenship are then granted to branding companies and brand strategies. And I think that the reason why is because this language has become, or this logic has become, so normalized. So national identity is slightly different than citizenship for me, and I kind of focused on media citizenship here because I think things like the practice of self-branding on social network sites is about media citizenship, and the practice of art making is about media citizenship. But clearly, I think that Henry and I, in his research group, were talking about this yesterday. I think that brand culture encompasses all of our relationships. That doesn't mean that I think all of our relationships are corrupt and only work in the service of accumulating capital, right? But I think that brand culture does encompass all of these things. So the things that we thought that previously were outside of things like branding, like national identity, like citizenship, I think are understood really only within those realms. Does that answer that? Yeah.
Actually, following up on that, you situate your own research very much within the neoliberal framework now and within Western capitalist framework, which suggests, which I don't think you intend to suggest, that brand culture only applies to a neoliberal Western framework. So you could in fact have multiple brand cultures. You could have a brand culture that is attached to a socialist system, a socialist political economy with a more collective identity structure perhaps, or group identity structure. Do you know of any work, or how would you see your work intersecting with people who might be studying brand culture in China or brand culture in sub-Saharan Africa or wherever it is?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I certainly don't think that brand culture is happening just here. But I do think that it has a different kind of valence and a different significance in different political economies. So branding is certainly part of socialism. And it is a very, very important part of socialism. It has a different kind of end goal. It's not about the free market and free trade, right? So the language of the brand and how it's used to brand socialism would be different. I also think that the labor that I'm talking about here, the labor of consumers, is understood differently in different contexts. Self-branding is really increasingly normative in the U.S. I don't think that it's normative everywhere outside the U.S. I mean, in different places it's more than others, because it's not so much about the commodification of the self in places outside the U.S. as it is here. I think, and this connects back to Tom's question, I think that one of the things that I'm really interested in is branding the nation. And this is also how these kinds of, these practices are used outside of neoliberal contexts. I will say, though, that that said, so this is not an argument about the kind of exclusivity of brand culture to the United States or to Western culture. I will say that neoliberalism and the expansion of economic practices and the simultaneous retraction of public services and public regulations, as things become more and more privatized, does provide a particular rich context for a specific kind of brand culture, which is, by the way, I forgot to attribute, this slide is from the animated short Logorama, which just won the Academy Award for animated short film, and it's precisely about this, how Western culture and the focus on free trade and the focus on free markets has created what, ends up kind of destroying the earth, right? So mine isn't such a scorch the earth kind of look, but I will say, Carola, that I think that neoliberalism provides a particularly ripe context for looking at this kind of stuff. Yeah.
Where do you fit into this sort of anti-brand culture? Certainly part of it as in buy local, avoid brands, and so forth. Is that all co-optable, co-opted, resistance?
Also a good question. I guess I'll answer first by saying that I don't always think about branding and brand culture as necessarily commercial, in the sense that, it is commercial, but necessarily in the sense, again, of accumulating capital. That there are ways in which brand cultures can be mobilized for progressive political ends, like, targeting specific consumption practices, anti-consumption, and so on and so forth. That said, I think that, and I don't mean to be clever here or to sidestep the question, I think that anti-brand campaigns, in order to become visible, have had to brand themselves as anti-brands. And so it's that kind of reliance on this logic of the market and this logic of market and economic visibility through technology, through cultural formations that I think, allows us to understand anti-brand. So I would include those definitely as part of brand culture, but I think the fact that they're anti-brand doesn't mean that they're situated outside of brand culture.
Well, except that they can be non-specific. I mean, if you take something, I think Michael Pollan argues this about food, don't buy anything processed, or don't buy anything your grandmother did, or whatever. It doesn't say what to do, it just tells you what not to do. And the whole notion of not doing that is harder to see quite working. And you can see it as becoming a slogan, but it's harder to see it filling all the other categories of branding.
Absolutely. And all these categories don't kind of, they're like in every chapter here, in every kind of cultural formation that I look at, there are different, I really try to look at very specific brand cultures for what they do or don't do. So for example, the self-branding chapter, when I look at girls on YouTube and on MySpace, I'm very, very pessimistic. It's a grouchy chapter. It is, this is really a huge problem. We need to do something about it, right? It's a very pessimistic chapter. The chapter on Shepard Fairey and Banksy is much more about the kind of contradictions in brand culture. And so I look at specific brands and specific cultural entrepreneurs to see what spaces might be opened up. So the anti-brand would fit into that. Yeah.
I wanted to come at the anti-brand from a slightly different angle. That Andrew Herman and Rosemary Coombs make the argument that the hunger of brands for goodwill, for social connectivity, makes them points of vulnerability and accountability for reverse pressure. They're talking about ad busting and culture jamming sort of things and modding. But we could also think about some of the Harry Potter alliances organizing a boycott of the chocolates tied to that brand, speaking as members of fan groups and brand communities to hold them accountable for fair trade practices and fair labor practices. And we're seeing more and more of that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. So I'm wondering to what degree you would argue that brands are points of accountability and vulnerability for companies as well as points of power if they're dependent on building these communities.
Yeah, I mean, I think again that that question is precisely why I theorize specific brand cultures and not brand culture, even though my slide says brand cultures, just put a little S there for me. That it is about brand cultures and very specific ones, and that there are contradictions in them. I would say that the Harry Potter Alliance, right, can point to kind of moments or spaces of vulnerability in branding and ask consumers to take certain kinds of action or be resistant. But I would also say that the Harry Potter Alliance is precisely an outgrowth of neoliberal capitalism, right? That you can't, that they happen simultaneously sometimes. So what I'm trying to do is to think about how it is that neoliberal capitalism provides these different spaces, and that some of them may, in fact, include, like we were talking about before, a kind of progressive mobility or a progressive impulse towards a certain kind of political action or political impact. I will say that the reason why I started this project, why these kind of ideas preoccupy me and I think about them incessantly, is not, again, because of a scorch the earth kind of viewpoint that I think we're all doomed, right? I think that some of us are doomed, and I think that some spaces are doomed, but that it's precisely within those other spaces that we can open up these moments of possibility, because this is what's happening, it seems to me. And so as I struggle kind of individually, being a professor, being a scholar of this stuff, being asked and taking seriously how it is that I should brand myself, how the school I work at is a brand in itself, how to build the brand. These kinds of things both kind of excite me and trouble me. And so so I enter this project with that kind of caution about the spaces, but also thinking about them in terms of possibility. Does that answer that, Henry?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Unfortunately, we
Oh.
have run out of
Sorry.
time, but I would, on behalf of the dean, who unfortunately had to disappear to pursue brand culture elsewhere.
Need to go expand Annenberg brand. That's okay.
Yes,
That's
brand,
okay. I won't take it
Annenberg brand,
personally.
exactly. I would like to thank our featured innovator